Island, New York. The most populated island in the United States is a beautiful place. Home to busy ports, stunning beaches, Billy Joel, the world's best bagels, revolutionary spy rings, and an extraordinary history. But where did it come from? And with the threat of climate change, where is it going? Long Island is no stranger to climate change. In fact, that's how it came to exist. So let's go back to the beginning of Long Island. Before the devastation of Hurricane Sandy as it tore across the Atlantic coast, before the modern melting of glaciers, before World War II, and the Long Island Express hurricane of the 1930s, before Teddy Roosevelt, the American Revolution, before Long Island was even settled. Here, Long Island, still, as you can see, in its present-day form. So let's go back further, 30,000 years. Long Island is nothing more than a shallow, dry basin. Rivers, however, are beginning to cut into the basin deeper and deeper, creating the bedrock of what would be the bottom of the Long Island Sound. From the north, a massive glacial movement, the Wisconsin Glacier, further carves out that basin, bringing with it rocks and soil, debris, sediment, and massive boulders which still litter the landscape of the North Shore today. As the glacier began to melt and recede, it left behind a massive lake in the basin. That lake would spill and drain into the ocean, creating the beginning of the Long Island Sound. 12,000 years ago, global temperatures increased, and because of climate change, sea level began to rise, creating the borders of a place that we would all call home. Long Island is no stranger to climate change, and it is ironic that the very same force of nature that created this beautiful home of ours is also its greatest existential threat. So what kind of effect can climate change have on modern Long Island? What sort of damage can it cause? To answer those questions, we'll look at 1938, just before the start of World War II, when the Long Island Express hurricane ravaged the Atlantic coast and for a brief time made Montauk an island of its own.
Of all the signals of the sea, none turns the faces of hardy sailors more grim than the flags that spell hurricane warning. One morning late in September 1938, the dread signals swung aloft along the Florida coast. Up from the West Indies, cradle of hurricanes, moved the Terror, a pit of low atmospheric pressure into which the air rushed from all directions to form a whirling, shrieking vortex of high wind and heavy rain. Hurricane! The Coast Guard watched it warily as it moved northward, paralleling the coast. That night it was off the Carolinas. Next morning it was off Maryland and Delaware, apparently swinging harmlessly out into the Atlantic. But a high-pressure area at sea deflected the hurricane back toward land. September 21st in mid-afternoon, this tropical terror struck, swept over outer Long Island, swept into thickly settled, highly developed New England, struck with winds roaring 100, 150, almost 200 miles an hour. Tidal waves 30 to 40 feet high struck a section unprepared. The great wind-driven waves swallowed the sandy bulwarks of the coast, washed away the pleasant beaches of Long Island's southern shore, literally changed the coastline. Bridges joining islands to the mainland were destroyed almost instantly. Men risked almost certain death trying to swim to their isolated homes, and the Coast Guard restrained them when it could. Flicking New York City with its outer fringe, the whirling storm smashed full force across Long Island. Thousands of homes along the seashore were shattered, mansion and modest home alike. The storm tore timber from timber, leaving only tangled wreckage. Millions of dollars worth of yachts and pleasure craft were smashed or swept far up on land, damaged beyond repair. Undermined roadbeds derailed trains. Passengers were marooned.
The Long Island Express hurricane of 1938 demonstrated just how vulnerable Long Island was. Some 682 people perished along the Atlantic coast. Damage was estimated at $308 million. Today, that would be roughly $5.1 billion. According to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Organization, if you take into consideration the growth of population and development of infrastructure, that same exact storm would have cost some $39.2 billion had it occurred in the early 2000s. The storm tide was some 15 feet in the water surrounding Long Island. 8 feet was recorded in Port Jefferson. By the storm's conclusion, there were 10 new inlets created on eastern Long Island, and the border of the southern shore was completely redrawn. So let's move forward, 74 years later, to the devastation of another superstorm, Hurricane Sandy. $233 people were killed as Hurricane Sandy made its way across the Atlantic coast. The storm first hit Cuba and Hispaniola, then the Caribbean before dissipating and regaining strength again in the Carolinas. It again formed a dreaded eye as it made its way north, eventually turning left, hitting New Jersey and Long Island. Devastation would cost $75 billion. Entire communities were destroyed like this one, in Breezy Point, where 100 homes were consumed by fire and floods. Wind gusts reached 100 miles per hour as first responders struggled to reach fires across Long Island. Shorelines and homes were decimated. This hellscape was the result of a Category 1 storm. The Long Island Express hurricane was a Category 3 upon making landfall. While these storms were both formed by different elements and weather patterns, they do share something in common. Warm water fueled their strength. Warm water is where a hurricane or a tropical storm gets its fuel. As the global temperature increases, as does the power, magnitude, and frequency of tropical storms and hurricanes. Glaciers, massive bodies of slow-moving ice, have been melting at a concerning rate in the past several decades. As glaciers melt and recede, the temperature of the water increases, as does the sea level. This greatly affects the coastal communities of Long Island, where erosion and flooding have become all too common. Like the rising seas that formed Long Island 12 millennia ago, we again face a reshaping of our home. NOAA, for the past 30 years, has been tracking what is known as perennial ice in the Arctic. This is a thick ice which makes it through the warm seasons and usually has a 9-year or longer lifespan. Watch as the perennial ice, the white ice, slowly disappears over the course of time. So here we are, back to the present. And as you can see, Long Island's 30,000-year tango with climate change is still very much alive. But how do we protect our homes and our communities? How can we stem this rising tide? Unlike 30 millennia ago, we have at our disposal limitless human ingenuity. Our island's future requires investments, planning, and for all those who call it home to be educated about the effects of climate change. We as individuals can make a huge difference by reducing, reusing, and recycling, by carpooling and limiting our daily consumption of energy. You too can play a vital role in protecting the island we call